Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who have been in the Artistic Research Summit this afternoon. It was such a spectacular start to this weekend. Welcome to anyone who's joining us for the Hook Lecture and to all of those people who might be online as well. My name's Neil Peris da Costa. I'm the Associate Dean of Research here at the Sydney Conservatoire of Music. It's the University of Sydney, in case you didn't know that. I feel very, very fortunate, one, to be among all these incredible people here this weekend, but also to work in this wonderful place. We have such fabulous facilities where music is taught and created every day of the week. I have fabulous colleagues. And mostly I want to say that it's very special that we work on this beautiful land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Music and dance has been being performed, celebrated on this land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Just down in the Botanic Gardens, we know that boys' initiation ceremonies went on with dance and cultural exchange and knowledge creation. And so it's on that tradition that we are lucky to keep going and to create wonderful music, artistic research, and all the other forms of music making that take place here. Tonight's very special for us because it's a Hook Lecture. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Huib, Schippers, had a lesson in that, to give the instalment of this Hook Lecture series. And I'd like to start by just saying a little bit about the Sydney Con. We consider ourselves one of the most dynamic centres for music, but I have everyone here who's presented this afternoon has talked about the dynamism in their institutions, and that's wonderful. We undertake a lot of no competition. We undertake a lot of music research, advancing the field through artistic exploration, scholarly investigation, and field work across a wide range of traditions. And our research embraces Western classical, Indigenous and non-Western musics, jazz, contemporary and popular styles. And we have a new music theatre course. And I can probably say this, that we are also opening a second conservatorium next year, or possibly at the beginning of 2027 in Parramatta, which is a really wonderful thing to be happening for Western Sydney. We're strongly committed to cross-disciplinary collaboration, bringing music into conversation with psychology, neuroscience, health sciences, engineering, and ecology. That's something that's quite new for the Conservatorium. We've been investing time and effort and money in multidisciplinary institutions here, and that's going really well. Within the context, our research takes several forms. Obviously, artistic research, where composition and performance and creativity are pursued as rigorous modes of inquiry. Music diversity, which explores the musics of many cultures, music education, examining how music is taught and learnt, and musicology, investigating practices past and present. And we also have the wonderful Paradisec, a world-class digital archive preserving fragile recordings from endangered cultures across the Pacific and beyond. The Hook Lecture Series happens sometimes 3 times a year here. It honours Alfred Samuel Hooke. He was an architect, a visionary and passionate advocate for music. He believed with great conviction that architecture, like music, was an art vital to people's prosperity. And he helped found the university's Faculty of Architecture. He was instrumental in the installation of the War Memorial Carillon, which is on main campus in Main Quad, and that's one of only 3 carillons in Australia, and played a key role in establishing the Department of Music in 1948, and that's where I actually did my undergraduate study, and it was fabulous over there. This series is made possible through a generous bequest from Doreen Robson, and it ensures that Hooke's legacy continues to inspire new generations of musicians and scholars. And it's really great to be able to embed the Hook Lecture into this summit and to have Huib here. This year, we reflect on the Conservatorium's leadership in reimagining how scholarship and creative practice come together. Embedding the lectures in this way reaffirms a dialogue between history, critical thought, and artistic experimentation. So just to say a few words about Huib, he is internationally recognised as we all know, as the leading voice at the crossroads of music education, cultural diversity, and sustainability, with a career spanning performance, education, research, journalism, and leadership in major cultural institutions. In Australia, he made a profound impact at the Queensland Conservatorium, where he was founding director of the Research Centre and then later its dean. He also played a decisive role in the recognition of artistic research in Australia, working with the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, the Australian Research Council, and the former Department of Education, Science and Training, to embed creative practice within the Excellence in Research for Australia framework. As the only music specialist in its inaugural iteration in 2010, he transformed the arts research landscape and secured a place for artistic research as a vital form of scholarly inquiry. Beyond Australia, Huib has also held significant international roles, including as director of the Smithsonian Folkways Recordings in Washington, D.C., and as visiting professor at UCLA and the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. He's now the director of the International Center for Cultural Sustainability in Daojing University in China. And I'd just like to say that I hadn't met Huib before this year. In fact, I'd heard his name and obviously read things by him, but he popped into the conservatorium in January when I was making a recording with Anna, who you'll hear tomorrow, and we went for a drink down at the Intercontinental, and he said, there really is a need for us all to get together and to talk about what's going on in Australia, particularly since the demise of the ERA, and there's some unrest around what's happening, what a new system would be, and what that means for the bolstering of artistic research in Australia. And, you know, I always like a challenge. I'm already very busy, but we said, let's do it. And then he put me in contact with the wonderful Vanessa Tomlinson, and here we are sitting in the room today. It's been a great pleasure to work with both of them. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Huib Schippers to give this Hook lecture and welcome his scholarly visionary speech that he's about to make. Thank you very much. Oh.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. Do we have sound? Can you hear me? Great. First, I'd like to acknowledge country and thank Auntie Jacinta for opening this with music. In many of these gatherings, we acknowledge country and then we forget about Indigenous issues afterwards. And I found that in one way it's a beautiful thing that everybody does it. At the same time, we should also realize that this is not about the first 30 seconds of a gathering. This is about everything that we're doing in our lives. And in my years here in Australia, I've learned a lot from Indigenous elders in just looking at the world in a different way. And I'm painfully aware that part of the discussion I will be having today is mostly about structures that were superimposed by European-centered thinking. So I'm not forgetting the fact that there are other ways of looking at the world, including Indigenous ways. I myself was trained in Indian classical music, and that for me was a complete revelation. I came from a Western classically trained family and then switched into raga music, and everything you believe about music is being turned upside down. And I think if we're talking about artistic research and broadening our minds, these are really, really important experiences. I'd also like to thank Sydney Conservatorium, the Hook Lecture, and particularly Neil and Vanessa for putting this amazing gathering together. This afternoon, the panel here said half the things I was going to say, so thank you very much for forcing me to rewrite my lecture. What I'll do today is exactly what you didn't ask me to do. I will talk a little bit about history of this rather than the future, Vanessa, but history from the point of view of a history of ideas and a history of action and a history of strategies. Because I think we are here, and that's how the discussion with Neil started, on not only how does artistic research work, but also how do we make people accept that artistic research is a core activity for universities, and it's not something you have to apologize for or we have to fight for. Universities have the job to embed artistic research in a successful way, and so does the ARC. And my work with the ARC over a period of almost 10 years, between 2005 and 2015, was very much based on that. It's not that the Australian Research Council is not interested in artistic research. There were just no ways of framing this in a logical way. And I'll talk about how the framework that was developed came about, and also what its weaknesses are, and also hopefully I will make some calls to action towards the future. So this is where it starts. This is where it starts. If you picture Johann Sebastian Bach sitting at his keyboard developing an ex contrapuntus for the art of the fugue, if you call to mind the many documentaries, the beautiful documentaries with Glenn Gould at his piano musing on how to interpret particular passages in the Goldberg variations or any of the composers he worked on, if you imagine Ravi Shankar sitting with his sitar working out the movements of Jogeshwari, a new Indian raga that he composed within the rules of that Indian tradition, I hope that some of you have seen the movie, the documentary This Is It, about Michael Jackson's last tour that didn't happen. There's one scene there which really strikes me, and sadly I couldn't find it, where he stops everybody and he's standing in front of this massive thing of screens and dancers and musicians, and you know that he's thinking, how do I bring this all together? So he's not happy with what's happening. To me, those shows are actually the new opera. I will make myself quite unpopular with some people, but I think the resources that go into these very big productions of popular music are very similar to the Gesamttheater idea of opera. But all of these musicians, in addition to being remarkable creative musicians, have something in common. And what they have in common is they think. Strangely, almost all musicians think. Which is really interesting, and they have different thinking processes. They're not the same it's not the same for every musician, but I've never met a musician that I couldn't catch thinking about something. More than 90 years ago, the very influential philosopher John Dewey, and if you don't know his work, I would recommend it, asserted that the odd notion that an artist does not think and a scientific inquirer does nothing else is the result of converting a difference of tempo and emphasis into a difference in kind. He wrote this in 1934. This could be our motto in what we are working on here with artistic research. So, the key question is, what is the thinking of creative artists like? We have inherited from the 19th century the idea that great artists are just geniuses who get possessed by some ineffable energy that leads to acts of greatness that mesmerizes multitudes. That's a beautiful expression, but it's actually not necessarily true if you speak to those geniuses. So was it Picasso who said it's 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration? There's a lot of documentation of musicians saying, no, it's not by accident that I'm this good. It's actually because I worked on it. So great musicians go through a complex and variable series of steps to get to a product that may lead to experiencing the aesthetic high that we in Indian music refer to as rasa. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, there was the Bharata Natyasastra was published, which is the first major work on the stage arts. And there's a beautiful concept of the aesthetic experience there called rasa, which says that when you feel sadness, because I tell you a sad story or I play a sad piece of music, it is not the same sadness as the sadness when your guinea pig dies. It's a different type of sadness. So what the artist does on the stage is to create an abstract version of this emotion that is then comes to life in the minds of the listener. It's a beautiful, very simple theory, but one of the most satisfying aesthetic theories I've found. I'm quite hostile to some 19th century theories, but I won't go on about that so much. So when we started talking about this at Queensland Conservatorium, and Vanessa was in the room, we thought, wouldn't it be great to have an entire wall with post-its and say, let's say, where does it start? It starts with a vague idea, and then the idea develops into different things. And then you go to the library to find a score for a particular piece. Then you go into your studio and you start practicing, or you get musicians together to start imagining how the opera works. So there's a whole process of decision-making, which are clusters of decision-making, and sadly I've never come around to working that out. It's a great ARC project to map out the clusters of decision-making from original idea to performance or dissemination. So some musicians are more explicit about this than others, but in many ways the process seems to resemble less library-based research, but more lab-based research in other disciplines. You have an idea, you check out the previous sources and experiments, you try new approaches, you fail, which is something that we sometimes forget is an incredibly important part of our work. You refine it, you try again, you probably fail again, until finally the whole makes some kind of sense, either 3 months before the performance or 3 seconds before the performance, as is very often the case. That process is not necessarily replicable. So in scientific research, research is seen as only valuable if it can be replicated. That research is not necessarily replicable, nor is it the aim of the research to be replicable. In my tradition, in Indian classical music, if I would interpret a raga exactly the same twice in a row, people would throw rotten mangoes at me, because that's not the point of the raga. The point is that every time you need to find a new interpretation. So we have to realize that not all the goals of research in the sciences are the same goals as those in artistic research. Saying that there's a similarity between the research that we do and the research in other disciplines does not mean that it does not take anything away from the concept of creative inspiration or from Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow. You think I have got an impossible last name. It took me years to pronounce Csikszentmihalyi. The idea of flow, during which the mind has internalized so many ideas and processes that they come out quite effortlessly. And hopefully all of you have experienced this. It's the most amazing feeling to be playing music and experience flow. And some people get very easily into that stage, and other people like me have to really struggle to get there. It's also important to note that these are not unique to the arts. Scientists speak of very similar states, and many Nobel Prize winners have said that their winning idea did not come from sustained research, but it came to them in the shower or while they were jogging, which is the 2 places where I get most of my ideas. But it is striking that their Nobel Prize winning ideas were in their discipline. It's not that somebody who was in biology suddenly said, I think E is mc square. So there are always people within the discipline, but it's a natural coming together of all the knowledge that you've gathered, yielding a new idea, which to me is one of the highest things that we can do through research and synthesis. So if it's so clear-cut that music making has a lot to do with music research, about 200 years ago, in Berlin, the very influential academic leader Wilhelm von Humboldt argued for separating the theory of music in universities from learning to perform music in order to ensure the former maintained the highest level of intellectual integrity. That fits very much in the 19th century spirit of Germany, making sure that there's pure science. And actually it reflects to some extent what music was in medieval universities, where it was a very theoretical subject and not a practical subject. So this decision this move by Humboldt, and there were others that were involved in it, caused a separation of musicology, which he considered a discipline worthy of the university, from the training of composers and performers, which he believed should be taught in trade schools or academies. And in the case of music, these were called Musikhochschulen, elsewhere known as schools of music, or Conservatoires or Conservatories, like we have here. So, in fact, what we're trying to do is to redress the mistakes that they made in Germany 200 years ago. In 2005, I think, I wrote an article called Blame It on the Germans, where I blamed 5 Germans, including Schenker and Hanslick and Herbart, for everything that's wrong about music education. It's a very compelling argument. So, how did music get back into the universities? Because Humboldt's model was very widely followed throughout Europe and the rest of the world. In Europe and the US, the practical study of music became part of universities only after the Second World War at a large scale. That was not so much inspired by intellectual or artistic motives, but rather by practical considerations and attempts to regulate higher education across the board. The same thing happened in Australia, as some of you may recall. The Dawkins reforms of 1988 invited conservatories and schools of music to join universities, with only a hint of persuasiveness. It's up to you, but we will only fund you if you're part of a university. And interestingly, all conservatories chose to become part of a university. Most conservatories were quite reluctant to find these partners. In 2005, it must have been very productive then. I wrote an article called The Marriage of Art in Academia, where I compared this to a marriage of convenience, where the beautiful creative girl settles for the rather dull banker husband to ensure food on the table and a roof over her head. This transition made sense in many ways. I'm actually not, some people are rabidly against the integration of conservatoires into universities. I'm not. But it did have unintended consequences that nobody was taking care of. I'm getting really good now. So, was everything resolved with this move? Not quite. Because the disciplines that we tend to refer to as creative and performing arts, which I've always found a really weird distinction. Boy, I don't know why performing arts couldn't be creative arts and the other way around. Were tolerated, but initially not particularly well integrated in universities. In terms of training, they were primarily considered to be like languages and funded as such. In 2011, I wrote Teaching Music is Like Pulling Teeth, inspired by our colleague Ralph Hultgren, to argue that music should be funded like dentistry, because we were funded like languages, my first 2 degrees were in language. This is why I can speak a bit of English. And languages you can teach in large groups and in small groups, but there's very little one-to-one teaching. I don't think one-to-one teaching is as sacred as it's held in many conservatoires, but certainly very small groups and one-to-one attention is absolutely necessary to create great musicians. So the argument was that much music teaching is based on one-to-one instruction with an expensive piece of equipment in the room, whether that's a dentist chair or a Steinway. And strangely, that worked. So we did a submission to the government, and the government said, we agree with you, but we don't have the money. So there is actually an agreement of the Australian government saying, yes, music is underfunded currently, but we're not going to fund it more. So that's kind of a half win. So what happened to research at the same time? Because that's what we're talking about tonight. In terms of research, projects that resembled work in letters, like or in anthropology or sociology, for instance, traditional musicology, historical musicology, ethnomusicology, were relatively easily accommodated. The research outputs looked very much like research outputs from other disciplines in the humanities. The better the journal you published in, the greater you were. But artistic work was rarely seen as eligible for funding, although there were some universities that we need to do something about this. And my predecessor as dean of the school in Queensland, Peter Roenfeld, once got research funding for a harpsichord as research equipment, which I thought was a beautiful, weird way of acknowledging that there is research when you play the harpsichord. In most universities, however, artistic work and performance, and somebody mentioned it this afternoon, had conveniently been categorized as service, which is the lowest of the research, teaching, and service category, the least valuable, seen as valuable function, just like being on committees and community projects. And as somebody mentioned this afternoon, many community projects, in fact, have a very strong research component. In the early 2000s, inspired by work in this vein in the UK and New Zealand, which were ahead of us, creative academics in Australia started lobbying for recognition of their work as research. on the basis of equity, which was a great argument at that time. So every country has its own magic words and every funding body has its own magic words. Equity in the 2000s was the absolute magical word. You could say it has to do about quality, it has to do with intellectual integrity. Nobody cared. If you say it's inequitable, then everybody pricked up their ears and say, we can't have that happening. It's important. These are important triggers. I'll come back to these. But not before I change the slide. So, meanwhile, in other parts of the world, particularly after World War II, artists in academia had already begun to reflect on their role in new environments and act on it, demonstrating that while some artistic practice can best be labeled as professional practice, much other work had clear and identifiable research components. I think this is a really important distinction to make, and Margaret Sears and I wrote an article about this also back in 2005, saying that trying to push everything into research, so saying that every time you pick up your violin, it's research, is not going to be very convincing for a wider audience. So there must be some kind of distinction between doing the things that you can do anyway and the things that you do which are innovative, expanding the knowledge of expanding the body of knowledge that we have. Somebody was mentioning the OECD definitions of research. So to us this became really important. And this has led to the seeds of what was called practice-led research or creative practices research, and now most frequently referred to as artistic research. Roger has done work on the methodologies and the different terminologies. The term artistic research became sort of globally accepted, first of all because it was easier than all the longer versions, and also because Henk Borgdorf, one of my compatriots, wrote a rather good book, The Conflict of the Faculties, where he described the intellectual conflict that led to calling things artistic research. I'm with the DDCA just in calling it research, because it's just a form of research, but you can also call other research traditional research or writing-based research or lab-based research. Artistic research will do, I think, for now. A major step internationally was also the so-called Bologna Declaration from 1996. The EU is not famous for making many good decisions. Which is not because they're bad people, but it's because they've got 27 countries with completely different agendas and it's really hard to get them together. I was really surprised that they got this together. So they created a single academic space across the 27 members of the EU, meaning that all higher education had to be structured in a similar way, with a bachelor, master's and doctoral structure, and how many credits were for each of those, including how many hours of work for the student each of those credits contained. So rather than saying 1 hour of teaching is 5 credits, it said if you have 1 hour of individual lessons but you practice your piano for 20 hours, that is half your credits for that week. So it's a very, very, very useful system. And with some EU funding, music institutions participated very actively in the implementation of that structure suggested by the declaration and were strategic in finding ways of making it work in spite of considerable differences in jurisdictions, because what was called Conservatorio in Spain was very different from what was called the Conservatory in Denmark. Several EU-funded collaborators emerged around the continent and the UK, some at the level of individual institutions, but the Association of European Conservatoires became a very powerful driver of initiatives to ensure a smooth transition to Bologna at undergraduate and graduate level, including artistic research. So their masters had to be research masters, and they started defining what research was in the research masters, and the same for the doctoral level. This also led to at doctoral level to a doc artist network with institutions from Finland and the UK and the Netherlands and Belgium, and the establishment of the very important Orpheus Institute in 2007. I think, Vanessa, you presented there as well at some stage. So we did some work there. Really a very vibrant intellectual center for artistic research. And I would recommend their publications, The Artistic Turn and Artistic Research in Music. The US is a very interesting, particularly at the moment, the US is a very interesting place, but the US was already a very interesting place before that started. There's a fair number of US thinkers and artists who consciously and subconsciously contributed to artistic research. I was thinking of John Cage. I mean, almost everything that John Cage has done, whether you like listening to it or not, stimulates our intellect in thinking about what music is and how music works. I mean, whether it's 433 or the wonderful act by Steve, the security guard that we used to open a Cage Festival in Queensland, which is somebody performs an act. So we had Steve open the door, and that was the first John Cage work that we performed. I think the thinking, I don't know how that happened. Sorry. The thinking that people like Cage had, whether he wants to call it artistic research or not, it's basically, like you were saying, Vanessa, whether you write it up or not. But the spirit behind it is definitely one of the great music thinkers and researchers of the 20th century. But recognition at the university level of research has really lagged behind. Even the DMAs, the Doctor of Musical Arts at prestigious US schools, they do require a lot of performance evidence, but rather minimal proof of profound intellectual engagement. So it's a shame Liam's not with us, because he did a DMA. I mean, Liam is a fantastic researcher and musician, but I was surprised to hear what a DMA at Harvard was in terms of intellectual engagement beyond the performance requirements. In spite of that, there's absolutely excellent work being done in artistic research inside and outside of academia. An ethnomusicologist called Stephen Felt has done amazing work in working with the sounds around the Kaluli in New Guinea, where he relates their sound with the sound of nature and makes new compositions and new work. Rhiannon Giddens, an African-American banjo player, has done incredible research into the history of African-American women, who she describes as on the crossroads of misogyny and racism, and created beautiful art out of that. And probably my favorite, and probably most known to all of you, is Laurie Anderson, who is pictured here when I was interviewing her. Laurie Anderson is someone who's tirelessly explores the boundaries of musical sound, of image, of virtual reality. Somebody who's completely fearless now in her late 70s and still completely unstoppable. I've been in a room, because I was running a record label, been in a room with quite a few famous artists. Laurie Anderson is the only one that made me drool and said, oh my God, this woman is completely uncompromising and profound and deep, and no false pretenses at all. Everything is real, and it's beautiful to see people like that at work. She should get an honorary DMA from somewhere, from here. Meanwhile, down under, I've got it. Meanwhile, down under in New Zealand, the PBRF, oh yes, there's also a picture of Neil when I saw him in January, echoed many of the ideas that had been developed in the UK and the EU, accommodating artistic research. In Australia, the next major impulse came from the announcement of the Research Quality Framework by the Labour government. The Research Quality Framework was never implemented, but it was threatened to everybody. So all the vice chancellors of Australia knew that the Research Quality Framework was coming. And ARC and the Department of Education, Science and Technology, is that the DEST? Probably. I forgot what the acronym means. They all came together and gathered a lot of us around the table and said, what are we going to do about artistic research? So we developed a very, very refined framework for judging and assessing research quality. And then the other party came in. And Kim Carr, the shadow minister, had been speaking about the fatally flawed RQF for months and months and months. So the ARC phoned us and said, we need to invent something else, which sounds like it's not the RQF, but it actually is the RQF. And this is how ERA was born. But it was really interesting that the activity that came around 2005, because RQF was announced, was absolutely immense. And suddenly vice chancellors had money to organize gatherings like this and got all their people together. We worked on manifestos and stuff like that. It was a very, very exciting time. Some of you in the room were part of this. So, what was the process of this happening? And now that I've embarrassed Neil, I'll embarrass myself as well. So led by DEST, the ARC and CHEST, the Council of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, they were always called that, and they played a key role. Meetings, discussions and publications took a flight in the mid-2000s with leadership from people like Margaret Sears, whom I mentioned before, and I should also mention Malcolm Gillies, who referred to music as the humanity of the humanities as a litmus test for an equality framework for research. And this had become a very powerful argument that if you want a research framework to cover everything that happens within Australian universities, it has to cover music as well. So it's not that please include us, it is you need to include us if you want to have a credible framework. And this is an argument that still should resonate. In spite of many initial disputes and many misunderstandings, you see me here trying to plant part of the digital garden that Bill Duckworth and Nora Farrell created outside Queensland Conservatorium. So I thought if you plant a Mac, then you probably get a Mac tree full of music. Turned out it didn't work at all. And I was almost arrested because the cage there was around the Wollomine pine tree there, and they thought I was trying to dig a tunnel to steal the tree. Very painful moment in my career. But in spite of that, dozens of representatives from across the arts came together with a shared sense of purpose, like we are now, and a dedication to developing a fair and equitable framework for assessing research excellence in the creative and performing arts. We did that knowing that this was a national framework, that it was going to have rules and everything, and that it was going to be imperfect. But the great thing was that it embodied an awareness and an acknowledgement by the government and by the ARC that this was a valid form of research. So we made that compromise and came up to the ultimate era, Excellence in Research for Australia, which was implemented in 2010 for the first time. What is important is the discussions we had on the way to ERA. Of course, we looked for possible mechanisms for determining research quality. We asked ourselves, is it the same as performance excellence, and came to the conclusion that that's not the case. But that was high on the agenda. It also became very clear very quickly that assessing public appreciation, or even the status of performance venues, were not really dependable criteria like journal rankings. Public appreciation at the time would have meant that Kylie Minogue was probably the best music researcher in Australia. And in terms of venues, which seems much more logical, I phoned the Sydney Opera here next door, and for $5,000 at the time, I could hire their smallest hall, play sitar really badly for my grandmother, and have a highly prestigious venue on my CV. So sadly, none of those things were particularly satisfactory. So in the end, the choice fell on putting the weight of the assessment on peer review of the artistic output against the 250-word statement on the research components of the work. That doesn't mean that you have to explain why your work is great. What you have to explain is what did you try from a research perspective with this work, describe what you tried to do, describe what method you used, and describe what came out of it. And that turned out to be quite doable in many, many cases. And where it was not doable, very often the case for research was quite weak. That doesn't mean that the performance wasn't amazing or the CD wasn't amazing, but just the research component of it was too weak to make a strong case for research. Another important factor, and I've heard that mentioned in the afternoon as well, in this discussion was research impact, and that is not going to go away. I mean, you see that in how the Australian government is moving at the moment, and governments everywhere. So where, when and how and to what extent does the research output feed back into some aspect of society? The article that I mentioned before that Margaret and I wrote suggested a model showing that the impact of creative work is multidimensional across sectors and time, which is not very convenient. So what you really want to do is give a 3-year grant, and at the end somebody says, and this was achieved. There's 100,000 children more speaking English fluently or speaking an indigenous language, and many of our projects are not like that. I'll come back to this in a second. I said compare ARC. This is not the Australian Research Council, this is the Arthritis Research Council that we got this idea from. And I'll explain to you in a second why the Arthritis Research Council is relevant to musicians, apart from in sad ways. So this included feeding back into research, into academic teaching, into professional practice, into policy making, into funding bodies, into local government, and finally into the lives of individuals and communities. So if we look at the projects that we do, very often we can identify these different phases of impact. And they don't all happen at the same time. And while even an academic publication might take 2 years to come out if it's a high-level publication, the effect on a community might be much longer. So they were difficult to measure, and they stretch out over time frames much larger than the reporting time of projects. I was thinking of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, where you think, well, what was the impact of St. Matthew's Passion? It wasn't performed particularly much until Mendelssohn, 100 years later, discovered it, and now it's one of the absolute critical pieces in the canon. So Bach would have not gotten another ARC grant if he said, well, I'm going to investigate how I can depict the life of Jesus musically in a different way from other people, according to St. Matthew's Gospel. And over 300 years, the ARC would have said, we're so wrong. So I'm going to delight you with this wonderful model. This literally comes from the Arthritis Research Council. So it says there is a stock of reservoir of knowledge. And in stage 0 of research, a topic or an issue is being identified, the project. So what are we going to do? Then very often in the first time you get a first level of peer review, and so some of you, I think Katz described that, a first phase of peer review and selection. Then you get input into the research, which is the funding support that we're all trying to get. Then stage 2 is the research process, very often with the emphasis on innovation in research projects. Then you get the primary outputs of research, which are knowledge production, which might feed straight into the stock of reservoir of knowledge with the little pink arrow, but also feeds into adoption, employment of outcomes of research for public or economic good. And then stage 4 is the secondary outputs as informing policy and product development. And then out of that come final outcomes, and then it goes back into the stock or the increased stock of reservoir of knowledge and into society. And we use that a lot to explain that you can't expect immediate results from every bit of research. As you can see, because it's from the Arthritis Research Council, it's not a problem that's unique to the arts, but it is a problem that I've discussed with many colleagues in ethnomusicology, where I work a lot, that very often we can't show we work in, Olja and I work in sustainability. To show sustainability, you have to show that 30 years later that music still exists and still flourishes. There's no grant that will give us 30 years' time to prove that. So we also have to be realistic about what we can prove and what we can't prove. And also make clear in grant proposals that this we can see after a while, and this will take much longer. Bridie's here. Bridie's done many projects where the result shows up after over decades. So we should not be fearful of those things. The other thing that Neil doesn't want me to do is to talk about Queensland. I'm going to give you a few examples of artistic research that I've been very close to, and I happen to be hovering around Queensland, just to give you a taste of what I see as the different categories. One of the seminal things in artistic research, one of the first things also we commissioned, was Around the Rondo by Stephen Emerson. He looked at the Rondo in A minor by Mozart, K511, And he said, I've been struggling with that bloody piece forever, and I have a sabbatical now, so I'm going to dedicate my entire sabbatical to interpreting that piece, so to get through that piece. And those of you who know Stephen Emerson, and some of his students are here, know that Stephen is very serious about stuff. So he read Leopold Mozart, he read Charles Rosen, he listened to about 140 recordings of the Rondo in A minor, and went through it bar by bar, struggling with ornamentation here, with expression there, with tempo there. And the wonderful thing about this work is that it's not an illusionary rise from I don't know how to play it, and it just goes better and better and better. So we have video of him saying after 6 months, I'm playing it more. The way I'm playing it is more shit than how it was 6 months before, which is something we recognize as musicians. So you practice your ass off on something, and it sounds worse and worse. And then 2 years later, you might open the score again and say, now it's there. So acknowledging these processes was really important. Stephen had the vision to make this absolutely cutting-edge technology, and he used, wait for it, DVD-ROM, which at that time was incredibly innovative, and now nobody can read DVD-ROMs anymore. So he created a non-linear history of his engagement with this piece, and it has 5,000 hyperlinks. So nothing is, you can follow whatever strand you want to do. You can follow the comparison with other players, but you can link that to what Leopold Mozart said, to what Charles Rosen said, whatever performer said about it. So there's a very forward-looking piece. And sadly, it's been overtaken by technology rather than by the way he addressed it. Vanessa and I were involved in a wonderful project called I, Orpheus with Bill Duckworth and Nora Farrell. In the 400th anniversary of Orpheus in Eurydice, Bill and Nora created a performance-based, digitally inclined version of that opera. And we performed it on the South Bank Parklands. And for those of you who've been there, there's bodies of water there. So the swimming pool became the Styx, and there was water percussion there, and Orpheus crossed the river Styx. It was a fantastic, surreal performer with a Tibetan singer as Orpheus and a jazz singer as Eurydice. Also with performances from other parts of the world being part of it, truly thought through of how do you recreate an opera for 400 years, not using the same music exactly, but in a way that appeals to a contemporary audience. I don't need to say much about Clocked Out because you just heard them. Eric and Vanessa have been doing fascinating stuff for decades now, always exploring new ways of working with sound, with ideas, with locations. I should mention the Two Oceans project by the Australian Art Orchestra with Frutilaya. Many fusion projects can be called artistic research because you take an Indian musician and you take a jazz musician, you see how it works. Usually it works quite badly if you listen to it carefully. So on paper, so on the CD cover it looks great. They bridge the gap between those two cultures. But very often they fall in the abyss between the two cultures because the one culture is kind of lost and the other culture is kind of lost. And these things only work if the musicians are profoundly at home with each other's idiom. And this is something that the Australian Art Orchestra did by working for many years with the Frutilaya thing. Another example that may be known to more of you is Shakti with John McLaughlin and Zakir Hussain. This is a group that's in the 60s already truly made a connection between jazz and Indian music. We just saw Leah Barclay, sadly another product of Queensland Conservatorium, in terms of doctorate, that is. She did river listening, but she's done a whole series of projects with community, with indigenous people, but many of them with a strong ecological perspective, making sound underwater recordings to see the health of the rivers that she's working with. Fascinating mind and fascinating series of projects that have deep thinking and relate music making to the ecological things. And I should probably also mention Heavenly Mozart by Neil, which got many fantastic reviews for good reasons. To end with Mozart, as I started with Mozart, as a triumph of academic and artistic expertise. It's possible. You can do incredible research and have incredible artistic outputs from that. So, where do I want to go with this? What did we get done in the past 20 years ago, and what didn't we get done? I think, and we heard that this afternoon, in terms of approach and content, we moved from the theory that artistic research could be developed in Australian university to credible evidence that we can not only keep up, but also be trend-setting. So the work that's being done here is not derivative of what's happening in the US or in Europe. I think it stands very firmly on its own. This afternoon we mentioned terminology. Maybe I was optimistic that to say that we have largely broken with the use of deficiency terms like non-traditional and other outputs. I violently oppose any such terms. It makes no sense at all to define these things negatively. So I think artistic research outputs, or what was it, Caro, or someone was saying, makes much more sense than already making, before assessment, already making, well, they're not quite what they really should be, but please look on them benignly. This is not the attitude we need anymore. I think it's really important what happened in terms of degrees. We have seen impressive work in the arts shifting towards new approaches and formats, particularly at doctoral level. So a lot of people have done very imaginary doctorates in music, but also in the adjacent disciplines. Also choosing different formats. Let me mention a Queensland example. Colin Webber, who looked at how he makes music for theatre, and found out while he was doing his PhD that he had Asperger's syndrome, which of course changes the interaction that you have with the people you work with. And he called his PhD, with tongue-in-cheek, Making Music with a Deficient Mind, which is anything but what he did. Both the music were fantastic, but his entire thesis was a non-linear thesis as a frozen website where on the left he had his own experiences in black on white, and on the right of the screen he had the literature around it in white on black, which became a very interesting way of absorbing things, also filled with hyperlinks. So it was not a thesis that you read from beginning to end, but it was a thesis where he led you to the beginning of the lily pond, and you jumped lily pond leaves through his knowledge. And I thought this would fail with external international assessors, and it didn't. Actually, international assessors were very enthused about it and praised the innovativeness of it, as well as the depth of the doctoral, of the artistic and research work. In terms of strategy, we have learned that the continuing dialogue with the field and the entire chain of research management, from Deputy Directors Research to DVCRs, VCs, policy and funding bodies, and both sides of the political spectrum, is essential. This, I think, is sometimes we are so full of our being right that we forget to have the strategy of how to communicate that in a successful way. And particularly CHAS, I have to say, the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, was very clever in getting us into the right offices on both sides of the political spectrum in order to make things move forward. And then in terms of promotion, we found that publicly communicating with fellow academics is important, like we're doing now, but also opinion leaders and the public at large. Indirectly targeting decision makers to score. So I wrote a whole series of articles on the higher education supplement of the Australian at the time. There were many people that submitted to the ministry, and I've been on some of those committees, so you get a huge folder with 500 pages of people that have written something. And of course, in the plane to Canberra, you read through all of those and you think, oh, that's a nice idea, that's not a nice idea. But I thought if you write I come from a journalism background, so if you write in the newspaper, in the higher education supplement, the minister gets up in the morning on Wednesday, gets into gets picked up by his car, and has the higher education supplement lying there. On his way to work, he reads that, and then he comes in and he asks his chief of staff, hey Harold, what Professor Schippers says there, does that make any sense? And within 3 articles, I was in the office of Kim Carr discussing what we should do by things. So we need to have these strategies in place in addition to being right and being clever. And particularly the idea of Australia has the opportunity to get this right after the Dawkins reviews, the Dawkins changes didn't really fully position artistic research in the right way. It was a very clever way of doing things because somebody could get political gain from this. It's sometimes better to say we have the chance to get it right than saying you're doing it wrong. So we learned a lot from how we communicated with the people in decision-making positions. So, where are we now? And how do we build upon this? I think what we have achieved is quite substantial. There's an awareness and a broad recognition of excellent artistic research in academia. We have a more or less solid structure for assessing artistic research in ERA, so at least there's a structure there that's been nationally implemented for all its flaws. And there's now a really large body of artistic research that demonstrates the feasibility of this work. So it's not a theory anymore that this is a good thing to do, it's something that we know we can do. I think there are threats there, and this is how the discussion with Neil started in January. Without a next era planned, there's a vacuum in the assessment and recognition of artistic research at a national level. In Australian universities and worldwide, currently the arts and the humanities at large are not in a very strong position. It's not only here that happens, but somehow in English-speaking countries. In the UK, there's absolutely carnage going on, and I don't even want to speak about what goes on in the US. So there's a serious risk that the next iteration of any research assessment system forgets to include artistic research, because artistic research assessment is inconvenient. It doesn't quite work like other things. So if you don't say it has to be included, there's a very good chance that they won't include it, and then we have another 20-year uphill battle to get it included again in the next system. The opportunities we have is staying loud and productive, and also staying self-critical within artistic research in the post-era era. I mean, who can resist writing post-era era? So I think sometimes we lack self-criticism. We think if you say it's artistic research, it is. We have to have this discussion. So we have to support each other across the country, but we also have to dare to ask critical questions. Because that's only how it gets better. And actually, in all disciplines this happens. This is how it gets better. We have to make sure that artistic research stays on the radar of university leadership. I've heard some very promising stories, some very, very nurturing stories this afternoon, but also some stories where the Vice-Chancellor have no idea what we're doing, and that's a real risk, because they go to the government and they negotiate with the government. So make sure that your deans and your DVC's research particularly are incredibly aware of this to the point of irritation. And one of the things that Vanessa and Neil and I thought of, it might be a good idea to have something coming out of this, like a manifesto on the merits of artistic research, or where we are artistic research and where we want to go. And make sure that we get an article in the Australian or a number of other places, so that it is really visible what's happening. So, now I have 2 conclusions because of this afternoon's thing, so this makes it complicated. This was my original conclusion. There's much creative work based on complex thought processes, extensive references, and lab-like experimentation. These processes are not always explicit, nor do they need to be. And because there's no hierarchy in this realm. So an artistic product that comes from a non-explicit thought process is not less valuable than one that does. But the type of research that we were talking about really reveals important things. It's important to notice that artistic research is not a made-up trick to make the arts fit into academia. Artistic research connects artistic and intellectual agendas in a way that both challenges and connects with the spirit of academia and nurtures in innovative practice at the same time. I think that's quite an important sentence. As universities have decided to house creative and performing arts, they have an obligation to be patrons and safe havens for artistic research, just like they have been for law, for medicine, and for technology. Many of the important changes in legal, in the medical field, in technology, have their origin in universities, where people are supported to do this research so that something new happens. There's no reason to not do that for the arts. And in a world of increasing fragmentation, and we're seeing that all around us, that has benefits for artists and for communities and societies at large. And there's a large body of work now on how music helps everything from the individual mind to societies. So what would our strategy be? First of all, we have no reason to be apologetic. Artistic research is diverse and fluid, but it's also valid and mature. And this afternoon I love that quote. Some questions can only be answered by artistic research. And that in itself is enough reason to honor artistic research. As I just said, we are not doing artistic research to appease the university. It's a form of research that nurtures the arts. What I found very interesting in the preparations for ERA, because we sat around the table with people from the STEM sector as well, and from the other humanities, is that many of our colleagues are very sympathetic to what we do, as long as we're building criteria for rigor. So there's actually very few people that say, oh, artistic research sucks. Even biologists and people from the medical field and astrophysicists, they say, cool, but make it really solid. I think it is neither wise nor necessary to try to force all artistic work in our institutions into a research mold. There's great compositions and great performances that have their own value and appreciation in their own right. So I think we weaken our own position if we push everything as artistic research. In order to be intellectually sound and equitable, any future research assessment must be designed sufficiently inclusive to accommodate artistic research. This is really a manifesto thing. So it's not that we have to say, please make it wide enough. Your research assessment system fails if it doesn't include artistic research. But we also have to realize that it's not enough to be right. We need to be loud as well. And if we want to strengthen our position, the world should hear it. In speaking out, we do need to carefully navigate between what Stephen Emerson calls the arrogance and the insecurities that characterize the lives of many artists. So there's this beautiful dichotomy and tension, I would say, within musicians, that we're really arrogant because we know we are within the arts, but at the same time we're incredibly insecure. And I think being too arrogant works against us, and being too insecure works against us as well. We need to find a middle way there. And while we need to discuss all the nuances of artistic research between us, like we are here, when we communicate, we should be clear and bring back the message to essentials, like teaching music is like pulling teeth. These things are really important. So the way we communicate should be a single communication. Artistic research exists, it's valuable, it nurtures the art form, it fits within universities, and universities have the task to do that. So let's make the points within the manifesto very, very clear, without saying we have 17 different terms for this and they all mean a little bit different things. That's something we need to discuss between ourselves, but I think there's enough consensus between all of us to say this matters and this needs to be addressed, and we need to make sure that over the next 10 and the next 20 and the next 30 years we have a feasible and reasonable and equitable framework to assess artistic research. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there time for questions, or?
Yeah, Hal, thank you so much for this incredible deep dive into the history of how artistic research has developed in the Australian landscape. It's so detailed, and I was actually smiling to myself because, just to relate a personal story, when I was at Sydney University in the music department, I remember my first couple of weeks, and I had a piano teacher who taught here at the Conservatorium, and I also, did my degree there. And she'd say at my lessons, right, I know they're going to try and make you read C.P. Bach's essay on how to play keyboard instruments. You can do that at the Conservatorium when you have your lesson. She was saying that there, but you can do that at university, but when you come to your lessons, we're not going to be opening that book at all. And strangely enough, she had it on her shelf as well. So it was a very strange kind of thing. But it reminded me that when I was at university in the late 70s, that was a situation that we had these independent institutions, which really, as we say now, train the racehorses, and the university departments, which thought that the conservatorians were not intellectual. And it's been a really big challenge to bring all those together. They were forced together in a way. I know there'll be lots of questions for you, and we've got celebrations to have outside, but I also wanted to, like what we're facing here at the Sydney Conservatorium is a situation where we are saying, yes, not everything's going to fit into research in the artistic space, and that's absolutely fine. We value what people do in creative practice, but the issue, for example, is in where does it fit into the workloads bucket? So yes, you have your teaching, etc. A lot of people here think of the teaching as their workload, and research comes in as a separate thing. I'm actually getting 40% of our salaries through our research, right? So you don't have to put everything in, that you do in performance and composition there, but where does that other stuff go? And that's a dilemma that we have. Where does your outward-facing artistry and things that you do, maybe playing with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra or whatever, where does that go? And we have this, just to fill in the gaps, we now have a new rule, which is basically if you do any externally paid work, the products of that can't be included in your workload. In other words, you cannot count that as a research output, even if research has gone into it, unless that money funnels through. That's a lot to say, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we might change things in the university system, because I'm sure we're all suffering with that.
It depends, and we negotiated quite a bit. So when I was director of the Con, I had horrible people like you that actually played music outside, which is very confusing for university. There's two aspects of that. One of them is that if you're externally paid, it should go into your research fund, and I'm sure it doesn't. So most readers tolerated the fact that people made money themselves externally. And what we tried to do, and this era allowed this, is see if we could build portfolios. So a single time of performing with an orchestra, unless you do something really spectacular, then it's hard to sell as a research component. But if you say, I did 4 concerts in a row or in different places, and this evolved, then you could make it into portfolios. So many of the performance-oriented people created portfolios from a series of performances and created a research question around a series of those. But it's not completely resolvable. So the thing is also, there is no system that will capture everything that we do in the arts. There's no system that captures everything even that we do in the university. So everything is always an approximation, and it's up to people like you, like the Associate Dean Research, to say, this is where I say this is research, and this is where I say this is really nice, but maybe you should put it as community service, or maybe you should turn it into a teaching experience. I think with the risk that we start saying we need to fill those 40% of research, so we'll put everything that you ever played there, then you run the risk. And when I was in the committee for the first era, the number of performing arts submissions had increased from 2,000 to 8,000, I think, and 6,000 were artistic outputs, but many of them were not very good. So many of them didn't have a strong research component. Actually, many of them sounded great, but many did not have a convincing research component. And I think that's how we undermine our own credibility. So it's up to us to say, you have to be able to make the case for the research component convincingly, and otherwise it is something else. But that's the fact that it's something else is not something that's going to be resolved by stuffing it into research.
Thank you. We're going to open up for questions. We have a roving mic. Lulu, just down. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Huib. Really enjoy your presentation. Just follow your last comment regarding the criteria of the artistic research output. So I just want to know, your opinion about on the quality of the artistic research. So who are the people decide the quality or criteria? What if, what's the criteria there? What's the standard? Who set the rules? Who are the people make the decision?
We have not found an alternative for peer review. So you need to send it to people that are in the same field and say, yes, this is solid research, or say, no, this is nonsense. So what the scientists try to do by saying, if you publish in Science or in Nature, we don't even ask questions about how great your research is, because they have a peer review system behind that. We don't have that in the arts. And all the peer review systems we have in the arts are about the quality of the performance and not the quality of the research. So we have to create, and some people said, let's make a repository and create a peer review system amongst us. I think that's probably the best way forward, because there is no existing system that has a credible way of assessing the quality of research. And people like Neil are the gatekeepers, so the Dean's research are the gatekeepers for this. And some people are blessed with people as open-minded as Dean, and some people aren't.
I was going to add into that, though, just more recently, it's been brought to our attention, I should have probably known this many, many years ago, but that when it comes to artistic research, for example, often the peer review is happening in the process of designing and getting grants, and you've got peer review going on there, because if you even get any funding, that's a form of peer review. And maybe we need to be strengthening our cases for saying that, yes, we don't have H indexes, and I mean, not everyone has that. We don't have those citation things, but we do have all of this, and what is that? That would be a thing. Yeah.
And that's why I showed the Arthritis Research Center thing, where there are different stages of peer review. And somebody, I think Kat also mentioned, that there's automatically inside the institution there's peer review already. But if you want to make it credible at a national level, you have to have peer review outside the institution. Bridie?
Hi, Huib. Bridie.
Hello, Bridie.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture, and thank you for being here and all that you have done for our field over decades. I thought you gave a beautiful and very poignant and timely reminder of the work that you've done here for many decades, but I am so curious to hear you speak about your position from China now. And I keep thinking, how would this conversation be different if we took a regional focus and we took a regional lens and we started to say who's in the room, and if we brought in colleagues from Southeast Asia, Māori colleagues from just over the ditch, how would the nature of this conversation change, and would that be useful? 15, 20 years ago, we were looking to Borgdorf and our European mates, and I wonder whether there's a moment for us to also collect ourselves nationally. I've felt that need for us to be together as a country, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how a regional perspective might challenge us in interesting ways in this conversation.
It would in many ways. As you know, in many cultures, there are no composers. We heard from Auntie Jacinta that she got the music that she plays from the ancestors. All my teachers in India, Indian music, say that ragas are not composed, they are found. So they exist in the universe somewhere, and you draw them down into yourself. So the whole process behind creativity is quite different in different cultures. So I think you'd have an incredibly interesting discussion, and one that would be even more difficult to structure than the one we're having now. So it's really a choice that we need. I think we need to have a conference about this. So by the time the government says next time, sure, we understand artistic research, then we should challenge ourselves by saying, let's get people over from Maori culture, from Indian culture, from Chinese minorities, and see how this holds up from an international perspective. And my prediction is that it holds up quite badly from an international perspective, except for the idea of peer review. Because when you play a young Indian musician, young Indian sitar player to a bunch of old Indian masters, they know exactly what is right and what's wrong about it. And my knowledge of indigenous culture is not good enough, but I've heard from people that work with it, like Mif Turpin, with indigenous people, that people know when they are ready to learn the next stage. So there's actually peer review amongst the women saying this person is now ready to learn that next step in the repertoire. So there are different systems of peer review in different places, but this is such a Western-oriented, and I apologize for that at the beginning of the lecture, this is such a Western-oriented structure that we're working in. So I think we have two things to do. I think your point is very good. I think one thing is, let's understand how this really works globally, whether what you say actually makes sense from a broader perspective, or even a Southern Hemisphere perspective. And at the same time, let's be incredibly practical and say, these are the levers to influence decision makers that fund our universities now, and let's make sure that we work that at the same time. But I'm very pragmatic and towards opportunistic in that sense. So ideologically, I completely agree with you. I think in how we organize it, we have to be very careful that we don't undermine ourselves.
We have a question from Nicholas.
Hello, Nicholas.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this really, really wonderful keynote that's so relevant to so much of what we all do. I wanted to pick up on the idea that you and Neil put forward, that there is lots of great performance and composition work that takes place in Australian Conservatoria that isn't research, and it shouldn't be sold as research, but it still has its own, perhaps different value. And it strikes me that there are kind of two purposes for the modern Australian Conservatorium. One is as a hub of music research, including artistic research, but also as a hub of professional training. I think Neil used the analogy of the racehorse training. So what I'm interested to ask is, what do you see as the kind of overarching mission of a modern Australian Conservatorium? And how does the non-research creative practice play into that?
That's a lovely question, and I'm very happy with that question. I think I've looked at the history of conservatories. The first one was the Conservatoire de Paris, the modern conservatories. I mean, there were ones in Italy in the 16th century, but the first one was the Conservatoire de Paris in the 1780s, and that came at a time. Should I talk that way? You'll probably see the back of my head. That came at a time that orchestral music was getting so complicated that it was really difficult to train musicians on the streets. So at the time of Bach and Mozart, there were no conservatoires. So the orchestral music became too difficult, and this is why they started. So people said, we need to have a place where we train musicians that can play this complicated stuff. At the same time, the Conservatoire de Paris was also a finishing school for ladies who could play a little bit of piano so that they could charm their banker or accountant husband. So there was also a training to get people married and to help society at large in a very dubious way. What I'm quite critical of is that conservatoires haven't structurally changed what they think their mission is. So the original mission is, we need to bring up young people to serve whatever music is happening in our society in the best possible way. What many conservatoires are still doing, and Australia is kind of in the middle, is we are training people for a reality that doesn't exist anymore. When I became director of the Conservatorium, I got my executive team together and say, if I look at our bachelor's program, I think it's absolutely perfect to make employable musicians in 19th century Germany. And this is something that we need to constantly investigate, and many of us are investigating that, and many of you are working with AI and with technology and with community, so there's many different ways of working that. So I think we need to get away from this idea that we're getting 180 new students in like we did per year, all dreaming of a career as a soloist or working in a string quartet, because they won't. We know that about 3% of conservatoire students end up to what they imagine they were trained for. I was at CalArts in Los Angeles a while ago, And I saw the first day of the dance trainers of the modern dance program, and the guy who convened the program said, "You all want to be in a contemporary dance company. I can tell you now that about 5% of you will be in a contemporary dance company, 15% of you will be in a commercial dance company, 25% of you will be teaching dance in different settings, and 40% of you will never have a job in dance." I thought it was confronting but very honest. And I think we're not particularly honest to our students. I think we are feeding an illusion that's not there. And this is also where research is very important. If we research what the need is for music for the next 50 years, which basically is flexibility, because we didn't know this was going to happen 20 years ago. We didn't know that AI was going to happen. We didn't know that streaming was going to happen 20 years ago. So we need to train students to be ready to be the musicians of the 21st century, whatever that is. And of course there's a place for somebody playing Beethoven string quartets, and it's beautiful and amazing music. But we also know that not everybody who studies violin will be playing Beethoven string quartets. So, and this, to bring this back to your question, Nicholas, this means that we have to teach in a very diverse way, where some people are focusing on performance, where other people focus on working through research, and other people are focusing on working in community, working through commerce. So I think the entire spectrum of what the world of music needs is what we need to serve.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks, Huib, for that. We should think about going outside and having some drinks and food. But just to say that there's a tension also in terms of, how artistic research is seen within our institution. I can talk about the Con, because a lot of amazing work goes on, but it might not be what we traditionally think of as, competition-winning performance. And so we sit in this weird space at the moment where this is very interesting research, but that, a singing teacher might listen to it and say, well, I don't agree, and that doesn't sound very good. But there is extraordinary research going on in there. That's a big question, but I think it's something that we have to deal with.
It's something I try to emphasize, that something that sounds pretty is not necessarily good research. Yeah. And some things that can be very good research and sound very unpretty.
Are there any final questions? And we've got time to now go outside and also talk
I'll be there.
ourselves. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Leo.